Our first speaker is going to be Craig Shirley, who is a Reagan biographer and visiting Reagan scholar at Eureka College. He's written 4 books on Ronald Reagan and 1 book on Newt Gingrich. He also wrote the New York Times bestseller, December 1941, 31 Days That Changed America and Saved the World. He's a lecturer, a frequent lecturer at the Reagan Library, and he's the president of Shirley and Bannister. And so with that, we'd like to welcome Craig Shirley. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. It takes me back in time. I grew up in upstate New York, and my parents were very, very active in the Conservative Party of New York in the early 1960s and dragged me and my brother and my sister to every lecture you could imagine by Bill Buckley and Jim Buckley. In fact, I think that when I... How about now? All right. Anyway, thank you. I'm looking at the lineup, and I'm looking at the people here, and I'm looking at the great speakers, and Mark Levin and Jeff Lord and all my other friends. And it reminds me of what Mae West said. She once said that too much of a good thing is wonderful. I am going to go over some of the ground that Jeff covered earlier and Mark covered, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper into it. As far as Reagan and what you all have in common with Ronald Reagan in terms of American conservatism. And I say American conservatism very distinctly because it's a very distinct difference between American conservatism and European conservative. They can't be confused with each other. One of the things I like about doing these type of events and working on books and interviewing people, and I've been interviewed everybody from Jimmy Carter to Walter Mondale to everybody associated with the Reagan campaign and the administrations and his childhood, but you get to meet people and you get to do interesting things and meet interesting things. And one of the things that I was able to do was on my last book tour, I went to New York to go on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, which before I went on I wasn't all that familiar with because I'm at that point in my life now where, as I describe it, I'm playing on the back nine. And so I wasn't all that familiar, but I had to learn about it from my children. And I think there's a line of demarcation somewhere around age 50 where people before age 50 know all about the Jon Stewart and the Daily Show, and people after that kind of know less. And you might call that line maybe a bright red line. I don't know. So I went to New York and did the show. Stewart was charming, wonderful. We had a lot of fun. But that afternoon, I had to do a pre-interview with the producer of the show by phone. And we were in our hotel room, and she's asking me various questions, and I answer her, and she's giving me some tips. And then she gets frustrated. She says, I don't even know why I ask you these things, because John just asks what he wants to anyway. And so we're getting to the point where we're wrapping up the conversation, and I said to her, I said, Jennifer, listen, I just have to tell you one thing, and that is that I think my children are more excited about me going on the Daily Show than I am. And there's a long pause, and she says, Mr. Shirley, we hear that a lot from men your age. I've said on a number of occasions and written on a number of occasions that Ronald Reagan was not Ronald Reagan before Ronald Reagan was Ronald Reagan. And by that, I think everybody understands what I mean, is that the Republican establishment and much of the political establishment here, they now revere Reagan. They use him as a weapon against the Tea Party. They use him as a weapon against conservatism. They use him, the Republican Party, they name buildings after him. They do fundraising in his name. During the 2008 TARP debate, I saw a commentator for a publication I won't name, but it claims to have a right of center allegiance, and he went on a cable show and claimed that Ronald Reagan would have supported the TARP bailout. Right, exactly. I mean, that was my reaction after throwing a shoe at the television screen. Is that I will tell you, and Jeff will tell you, work for him, is that it's utterly completely reckless to say what Ronald Reagan would have done or what Ronald Reagan couldn't have done in any situation. is that all we can go off of is records, his words, and his deeds, but we can make a heck of a lot better case that he would have opposed TARP than they could make that he would have supported TARP. So we have to understand is what he went through is much in the way of what you've been going through, your lives or the last 5 years or ever since you get involved in grassroots politics, is that from the time of his political career, from the very, very beginning, he opposed the establishment, and the establishment was deadly set against Reagan. In 1966, he decides he's going to run for governor of California, and he takes on the establishment. The establishment doesn't want Ronald Reagan. They don't want this, well, he was derided as a grade B actor with premature orange hair. And that's a direct quote, by the way. Gerald Ford said that about Ronald Reagan. But in 1966, the entire California establishment is supporting George Christopher, who is the moderate Republican mayor of San Francisco. They don't want this guy, this actor, who was in Bedtime for Bonds or whatever. Well, guess what? The elites of the Republican Party are dead set against him, but the people are for Ronald Reagan. And that becomes the hallmark of his career, is that the elites always opposed him. They always fought against him. It was the political elites, the media elites, the academic elites, the elites of the Republican Party. He does the same thing. So now he beats Christopher, and then he goes on to win in 66 by almost 1 million votes. Revolutionizes the California economy, revolutionizes the California budget. He's looking around now in 1974, 75, and he sees to his dismay that Gerald Ford is carrying on the very same policies that drove conservatives away from Richard Nixon, the détente. So Nixon went to Moscow, so Ford goes to Vladivostok. Nixon names liberal judges, so Ford names liberal judges. Nixon engages in wage and price control, or fiddling with the economy, and so Ford announces wage and price controls. And he's continuing these policies, but the significant difference between what Ford didn't understand was that he had no relationship with the American conservative movement that Nixon did. Nixon had what the Irish call the spoons in his pocket because of his work against Rosenbergs and Alger Hiss, and because of his anti-communism of the 40s and the 1950s. So he could move to the left. Gerald Ford couldn't. And when Gerald Ford moves to the left, Reagan sees the opening. But what really sets him off, and would have set off any of us, and some of us remember this, in 1975, the Soviets expelled Alexander Solzhenitsyn from the Soviet Union. Of course, Solzhenitsyn had won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was the author of the Gulag Archipelago. He was the author of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. He'd been in prison for 7 years in the Gulag in the Soviet Union because he had criticized Joseph Stalin in a private letter to a friend. That was his crime. But he's expelled because he's an embarrassment. They can't kill him because there's too much sunlight on him. So he comes to the United States, and nothing. Ford, at Henry Kissinger's urging, refuses to acknowledge his existence, refuses to welcome him to the White House, refuses to acknowledge or give any type of official ceremony. So instead is that he is welcomed officially by Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina and Senator Joe Biden of Delaware. They are the ones who officially welcome Alexander Solzhenitsyn to America. Reagan has no official role because he's an ex-governor, but he welcomes Solzhenitsyn unofficially. But in the meantime, he also writes a column excoriating Ford. He gives a radio commentary excoriating Ford. And this is what finally sets him off to take on Gerald Ford in the Republican primaries, was that the image of the President of the United States knuckling under to the Kremlin, knuckling under to the Soviets because they didn't want to meet with Solzhenitsyn for fear of angering the Kremlin. So Reagan plunges into the campaign. Now, I want to read you one short paragraph from his announcement in November of 1975. In my opinion, the root of these problems lies right here in Washington, D.C. Our nation's capital has become the seat of a buddy system that functions for its own benefit, increasingly insensitive to the needs of the American worker who supports it with his taxes. Today, it is difficult to find leaders who are independent of the forces that have brought us our problems: the Congress, the bureaucracy, the lobbyists, big business, and big labor. If America is to survive and go forward, this must change. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So he jumps in, and of course, the entire establishment, columnists denounce him, the Republican National Committee opposes him, the state parties are opposed to him. What few elected Republican officials in the country are opposed to him. He has the support of Paul Laxalt and Jesse Helms and a few other courageous elected Republicans. But other than that, the whole system is arrayed against Ronald Reagan. And yet, even in the face of that, even in the face of being denounced by the media, being denounced by the Republican establishment, being denounced by Gerald Ford, being denounced by Nelson Rockefeller and everybody you can imagine, he goes to Kansas City in August of 1976, and this is the first time in the history of the Republican Party since 1952 when Republicans gathered not knowing who their nominee was going to be. The last time you'd have to go back to was Taft and Eisenhower in Chicago, and Taft went in with 570 delegates, and Eisenhower went in with 70 delegates, and Eisenhower won the nomination. That's for another story. Reagan loses the nomination by 57 delegate votes out of 2,259 delegate votes cast. I mean, it's astonishing. And if you look in what was going on with the Ohio delegation, what was going on with the Mississippi delegation, there were 150 uncommitted delegates. Delegates used to run as uncommitted in those days. Is that, and they were being offered all sorts of things by the Ford White House, trips on Air Force One, tickets to state dinners. Is that they came as close to what reporters said at the time, almost corrupt behavior in getting the nomination for Gerald Ford over Ronald Reagan. But the real irony is this: is that if Ford had stopped Reagan, if Reagan had stopped Ford from winning the nomination on the first ballot, he probably would have been nominated on the second ballot because a lot of the delegates from North Carolina and Kentucky and several other states were mandated to vote for Gerald Ford on the first ballot, but they would have been free to vote their own preference on the second delegate, and Reagan was their real choice. Now, he gives one of his most important speeches of his life is his extemporaneous speech on the last night of the Republican convention. And he upstages Gerald Ford, and one writer at the time told me he wrote a piece in which he said that Ford won the nomination, but Reagan won their hearts. A friend of mine, Kenny Kling, who was the field director for Ronald Reagan in 1976 and 1980, was standing on the floor of the convention at Kemper Arena in Kansas City as Reagan is giving this marvelous speech, and she's a big-time, he said she was a big-time Ford supporter. And as Reagan is speaking, she says to nobody in particular, but loud enough for Kennedy to hear, she says, "Oh my God, we've nominated the wrong man." Now, Reagan is 65 years old. This is considered by many to be his swan song. His political RIP is written by many journalists, and the Republican Party is saying, well, we're done with him. All right, let's move on to some serious people like Howard Baker and George Bush and John Connally and Nelson Rockefeller and Lowell Weicker. But Reagan says, now, so the elites of the party, the elites of the media have written him up, but Reagan says, I don't think so. He engages first of all, he becomes the most noteworthy conservative speaker and opponent to the Carter White House in the 1970s. He actually leads the charge against the Panama Canal treaties. As an example of how much the establishment was against Ronald Reagan in 1977 and 1978, as he's leading the charge against the Panama Canal treaties, Bill Brock, who's the chairman of the Republican National Committee, asked Reagan to sign a fundraising letter for the RNC against the Panama Canal treaties, and Reagan says, delighted to, I'd be happy to. He signs the letter. Over $1 million cascades into the Republican National Committee, which that was in 1977 dollars. So what would it be today? $5–10 million? So Reagan goes to Brock and he says, well, Mr. Chairman, I've raised all this money for you. Can I have a little bit to pay for a Panama Canal truth squad to travel the country again to mount a grassroots campaign? And Brock says no. Does not give Reagan a dime off the money that was raised in a direct mail letter that was signed by Ronald Reagan against the Panama Canal truth squad. Of course, Laxalt and Lynn Nofsinger, a dear friend of mine, key Reagan aide, were furious. They went public against Brock Reagan vows he's never going to sign another letter again for the Republican National Committee, and he doesn't until he takes control of the party in Detroit in 1980. But as he is campaigning in the wilderness years between, and I've written a book about this that's coming out next year, the wilderness years for Reagan between 76 and 80 are very important because he's developing a new conservative philosophy. And he expressed it in a speech to a group of conservatives here in Washington in 1977. He said, "The Republican Party can no longer be one limited to the country club big business image that is burdened with today. The new Republican Party I am speaking about is going to have room for the man and woman in the factories, for the farmer, for the cop on the beat. Our task is not to sell a philosophy, to make the majority of Americans who already share that philosophy see that modern conservatism offers them a political home. We are not a cult. We are members of a majority. Let's act and talk like it. The job is ours, and the job must be done. If not by us, who? If not now, when? Our party must be the party of the individual. It must not sell out the individual to cater to the group. No greater challenge faces our society today than ensuring that each one of us can maintain his dignity and his identity in an increasingly complex and centralized society." And then he went on further, and this was a shot across the bow at the Republican Party at the time, the Republican National Committee. "Our party must be based on the kind of leadership that grows and takes its strength from people. Any organization is, in actuality, only the lengthening shadow of its members. A political party is a mechanical structure created to further a cause. The cause, not the mechanism, brings and holds the members together. And our cause must be to rediscover, reassert, and reapply America's spiritual heritage to our national affairs. Then, with God's help, we shall indeed be a city upon a hill, with the eyes of all people upon us." That was the new Republican Party he set out to create, and he did so, running again in 1980. Now, as you can imagine, is that if they were opposed to him in 1976, they were really opposed to him in 1980 because he had pretty much cleared out the field. He is the front runner in all the polls, and he starts in 1978 and 79. He's listening to his consultants. They say, "Oh, Governor, you don't need to go into Iowa. It's not important." So he doesn't go into Iowa, and he loses to George Bush. One of the stunning political upset. George Bush was called in the media. They called him the asterisk. You know, is that he was nothing. He was nowhere. Nobody knew him outside of party circles, but he had worked harder, and Reagan didn't. Reagan, once again, as he did in North Carolina in 1976, when he stopped listening to the consultants and started listening to himself, he won the North Carolina primary, which was one of the biggest upsets in American politics. And he does so again going into New Hampshire in 1980, where, most people ascribe his win to the famous, and we've all seen the video of, I'm paying for this microphone, Mr. Green. But the fact of the matter is that he had campaigned assiduously for 5 weeks. He just planted himself in New Hampshire like a stout maple tree. He didn't leave. He said, I'm going to campaign the way I want to campaign, which was going out and meeting people and talking to them and conveying his message of freedom, hope, and opportunity and the future to them. He wins the New Hampshire primary, and which sets him on the way. But, again, to tell you about what a struggle it was to get the nomination, it wasn't a slam dunk after New Hampshire. That's a myth. He doesn't get the nomination. He doesn't win enough primaries because George Bush is still in there fighting. He doesn't win enough delegates for a first ballot nomination until June of 1980, and the convention is in July of 1980. So he doesn't go over the top until June 5th, 1980. So that tells you is that, again, he had to fight for it. Nothing was going to be handed to him. He goes to the convention and gives what is, again, a remarkable, remarkable speech. It's easy. You can say, John Kennedy, these 5 speeches were his greatest 5 speeches, or Franklin Roosevelt, these were his 5 great speeches. Day of Infamy, obviously, is best. But with Reagan, he had so many fine speeches, it's sometimes hard, to say, well, this was his best speech because he had so many good ones. And as a matter of fact, is that reporters would report when Reagan actually gave a bad speech because it was that rare that he actually gave a bad speech. But again, he's listening to the consultants after he wins the nomination. And his campaign drifts into the what we call the horse latitudes politics. Carter is tenacious. Carter fought to win the presidency. Carter's going to try to keep the presidency. And truth be told is that American people do not like to throw their incumbent president out of office unless they have a very sufficient reason to do so. And we all know in 2012 there wasn't a sufficient reason given for conservative governance and opposed to collectivist governance. Only in 1932, from 1900 to 1980, only in 1932 is there a straight-up choice between the Republican candidate nominee and the Democratic nominee is that the incumbent is booted out. 1912 is anomalous because there were 3 candidates that year. They divided the Republican vote, Taft and Roosevelt. And 1976 was also anomalous because Gerald Ford was an unelected incumbent. The voters had never made a psychic investment in him before by casting a ballot for him for President of the United States. So, is that it's very difficult to beat an incumbent president, and it's proving in the polls in the fall of 1980. Carter has moved ahead in the national polls. Reagan campaign is not doing well. He's not doing what he's good at, which is just going out. You know, Lynn Knopfsinger once told me, he says, you know, every 4 years we got to go through this. You know, people want to reinvent Reagan or make their own, you know, Reagan, and the best thing to do is just let him go out and talk. So he decides at the last minute that he is going to debate, or he challenges or accepts Carter's challenge to a debate 1 week before the election. 1 week. Walter Cronkite that night goes on national television and says the outcome of the presidential campaign will probably be decided by the winner of this debate. And he goes and he gives what is considered by most to be a superb performance by the American people. Of course, again, all the elites go on Today's Show the next morning. They say, well, Carter won. And David Broder wrote for the Washington Post, well, Carter won. And Meg Greenfield wrote for the Newsweek, well, Carter won. Everybody in Washington, all the elites, all said Carter won. But then the polls come out in the days afterward, and then guess what? The American people say otherwise. This is that they say that Reagan won, and by a healthy margin, too. It wasn't 3 or 5 points. It was some polls added by 20 or 25%. Now, I'm thoroughly convinced, and Pat Goodell, who was Jimmy Carter's pollster, told me he was convinced also. Absent that debate, Jimmy Carter wins re-election. Absent that debate, is that Reagan took control of his own destiny. He articulated his vision. A lot of people say, well, you know, he won the debate with, you know, there you go again, or in his closing summation where he said, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? But for me, the line that I think crystallized it was the very last line where he said, I want to take government off the backs of the great people of this country and turn you loose again. That was the ultimate Ronald Reagan. He didn't trim his sails. You know, Nixon used to say, well, in the primaries you run to the right, and then in the general election you run to the middle. Reagan runs to the right in the primaries, and then he wins the nomination and he keeps running to the right. He keeps running as a Jeffersonian conservative. He's infused with Solzhenitsyn. He's infused with Paine. I've only got a couple minutes here, so let me wrap this up and give you three Reagan parables. First of all, the study of Ronald Reagan is, for me, is because he's utterly fascinating as a political character, as an individual. I worked on the campaigns. I worked with the Republican National Committee. We did independent expenditures in 80 and 84 supporting his candidacy. You know, we were always over this, you know, like because we were, you know, working on aid to the Contras or SDI or tax cuts or whatever. So we were always, you know, involved in some way, shape, or form. But also because he has to be considered, and not by me. Liberal historians will tell you. John Patrick Diggins, who was in many ways the unofficial historian of the American left in the 20th century, wrote a book. He wrote all liberal books his whole life about the women's movement, about the labor movement, about this movement. But his last book is called Ronald Reagan, Fate, Freedom, and the Making of History. And in that book, this liberal academic, this liberal author says Reagan is one of our 4 greatest presidents because, along with George Washington, Franklin Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln, because these 4 men saved many, many lives, and he thought that was the standard for greatness in an American president. If you save or free many, many people, then that was the great standard. James McGregor Burns, who is Franklin Roosevelt's biographer, also put Reagan in the category of great presidents. So we study him because, one, because he's a fascinating individual, because he's a fascinating character, but also because he put into practice for the first time in many years, maybe since Calvin Coolidge, the idea that conservative is practical. Conservative is idealistic, but conservatism is also practical in our daily lives, in local government, in state government, and national government. I want to leave you with 3 quick parables about Reagan, and I know, I'm watching Bill. Is that you all heard the story about him and the noble, tear down this wall speech where he, put it in the speech, and then the State Department took it out, and he put it back in, and the State Department took it out again. Well, in 1980, he was giving an address during the campaign to the American Legion. And, of course, as many of us remember, is that the Vietnam War was taboo. It was verboten. You couldn't talk about it. You couldn't praise it. You couldn't say that what he wanted to say was he wanted to go to the American Legion, the National Convention, and say it was a noble cause. And he put it because the ruling elite says is that there was moral ambiguity between South Vietnam and North Vietnam because the Pentagon was evil and because it was a waste of time and money and effort. And Reagan wanted to tell these American Legionnaires that, no, it was a noble cause. And he put it in the speech, and the speechwriters took it out, put it out of the draft. He puts it back in. The speechwriters take it out a second time. He put it back in, and he gives it. And, of course, everybody at the Washington Post and CBS, they get the vapors. Oh, my God, he called Vietnam a noble cause. What an awful, terrible thing. But he wanted to tell the American people what they needed to hear was that 55,000 boys did not die in vain in Vietnam. Yeah. And that was exactly the reaction he got from the Legion, exactly the reaction he got from the American people. The elites hated it. The American people loved it. That's an example of having principles. He also had faith. On the eve of the 1980 election, he goes on national television. He says to the American people, since her beginning, America has held fast in this hope of divine providence, this vision of man with God. It is true that world peace is jeopardized by those who view man not as a noble being, but as an accident of nature, without soul, and important only to the extent he can serve an all-powerful state. But it is our spiritual commitment, more than any military might in the world, that will win our struggle for peace. It is humility before God that is ultimately the source of America's strength as a nation. Now, that was also a courageous thing to say because the elite said you can't go tell the American people that. So he had principles, he had faith. But he also had a sense of humor. And you all know, we're all aware of it. In 1967, again, during the height of the Cold War, there were anti-war protests everywhere in the country against the Vietnam War. And Reagan one day out in California was confronted by a very smelly, odorous, dirty, disheveled hippie. Maybe it was Bill Clinton, I don't know. But the smelly, disheveled, dirty hippie is carrying a sign that says, "Make love, not war." Reagan looks at the hippie, he looks at the sign, he says, from the looks of him, I don't think he could do either. Let me just say in closing, with your principles, with your faith, with a good sense of humor, you cannot fail. Thank you very much.